critical challenge of AR and VR in courtrooms is regarding identification of parties. Procedures to identify identity of parties in virtual reality courtroom setup may be inadequate or subject to question by aggrieved parties. Several courts in India have made identity verification a must for even moving court. This obviously indicates a judicial bent towards stricter identification measures for courtrooms. This also has reasoning in the rising cases of security lapses in court complexes in India, leading to assault, murder, and threat to judges and judiciary. Inadequate identification measures in virtual courts can reduce trust of public in the justice process and subject parties to harassment if a misrepresented person enters a courtroom and hijacks a hearing. The second question is of challenge relates to expense. Virtual reality courtrooms require specialized equipment that may be far too expensive for the average litigant. Video conferencing started in India during the pandemic has succeeded in showing the gap between rich and poor litigants. This gap would become even worse if virtual reality courts are made the default choice in the Indian context. Lastly, but not least, is the challenges faced by various judicial bodies in deciding crimes out of or in virtual reality and augmented reality. This spans a wide variety of cases, including the areas of law which I have personal expertise in, which is intellectual property, so IP infringement cases. But there are also examples of real-world crimes in AR. And a topic that I am personally very interested in is the changing role of human identity in virtual worlds and the different issues of ownership of identities that this would bring up, which the courts would have to adjudicate on. For example, courts would have to decide whether stealing someone's virtual reality, an avatar, would constitute the same level of crime as stealing somebody's identity in the real life. For realistic avatars, India in particular has substantial precedent for protection of such identities in the case of public figures. However, non-public figures may have to struggle to deal with the choice of having to give up their identity. In courtroom applications, avatars may be used in courtrooms to represent a particular litigant. This also raises a question of a singular identity in the virtual world. So in the case of a courtroom context, if a litigant is expressing himself through a particular avatar, and the hearings, as they do go on for a long time, would that mean that this particular avatar of the litigant be exclusively owned by this person? Because otherwise there are people in the virtual reality world who could use this avatar for different purposes. So for certain applications, should the courts decide to use a singular avatar for a singular purpose? These are the kinds of questions that would come up quite a lot. Does customizing your avatar to resemble yourself accurately mean you hold the same rights in it as your human body? In copyright legislation, the concept of fair use and derivative works would also experience a change with the use of AR and VR. In the case of AR, when AR artists use the physical world as their canvas, there will be copyrighted works in the form of artwork, statues, architecture. Would morphing in a copyrighted work into another similar object infringe the right to create? Or is it fair use? What if the software needs to first copy the copyrighted work and then alter it? In terms of children privacy, questions might arise regarding negative effects of data sharing of children who, as of now, in terms of gaming, are the prime users of virtual reality and augmented reality, and what protections that game publishers need to include in order to ensure that privacy infringement doesn't happen. In India, there are statutes which have covered these issues in some capacity. For example, the central government recently amended the Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines, according to which certain kinds of games which have an addictive quality would require the gaming publisher to include safeguards. Now, the question would arise from a judicial context: what kinds of games would be considered addictive games? This would be quite a subjective process of deciding what constitutes addictive games, because in the case of augmented reality and virtual reality, the immersive nature means that everything is addictive. Personally, I am very interested in following the identity-related questions that will come up through the use of virtual reality and augmented reality. And I'll be following the progress in the coming years. So with that, I end my presentation, and thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Shreya. I think I would say that you've broadly touched, and as a wholesome keynote address, I would say you've touched most of the issues that we want to delve into in more detail, even during the Q&A today. So with that, I think I first want to probably just circle back. You also broached this, that Casey is probably a good person to distinguish and maybe explain to us a lot more in lay terms what AR and VR systems are, how they are operating across industries, not just in the judiciary. Like we realize through the keynote address that there's obviously a significant amount of potential application that can happen in policing and investigation, in court processes. We'll come back to that, but I just wanted to get a sense, Casey, since you do work a lot with AR specialists, and if I'm not mistaken, a part of your role is actually like disseminating how these tools are to be utilized in different sectors and different industries with the specialists at Meta. So probably you could give us some more insights on how, like, basic functionality of these systems, what are the key distinctions, and how different industries are deploying them in simpler terms.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll just tell you a little bit of story. I come from a non-technology background of coaching gymnastics, of a span of almost 2 decades of coaching youth gymnastics. And I started working in technology, and one of the companies was virtual reality. And I really didn't know what that was. It's quite difficult to explain what you experience when you put this toaster-sized thing on your head. So it's, at that time, it is still quite big, but essentially putting a box and you're being completely immersed into a new environment. And that's kind of how I explain that to my children without having them experience it. Granted, they do experience it when I'm watching. So virtual reality is taking that full field of view that one would have and immersing that into a new reality or new experience. That could be a digital one, that could be a recorded experience that's done with 360 video cameras. So that's how I explain virtual reality. That also comes on top with different wearable devices. I know that prior she mentioned about wearing haptic suits, and that also immerses your body into experiencing what is not physically there. Then we also have augmented reality, and this is where you are putting a digital layer on top of the real world space. So, you know, the way I like to explain it to children, it's like, you know, if you saw a ghost inside your house, and sometimes augmented reality can be like a ghost in that sense. But there are different things, like it's not just what is going outward that is what's happening with these technologies. These technologies are actually taking they are scanning the space through the camera lens or the sensors and mapping out what is out there, and then giving you a perspective to lay those digital layers. And that's what we call mixed reality too. So you're able to go from a completely virtual reality blacked out and switch it to it's like glasses and being able to see that digital space. So this is where it gets really exciting, because I like to think of it as allowing people to see space. And there's three different basic ideas here. We're able to see inside spaces. whether that, we talked about the crime scenes, recreating that. We're able to see those spaces. We're also able to see across time. So we're able to go back into time. We're able to move that timeline forward and backward. And we're also able to see across possibilities. So in this sense, I like to take what I call, AI. It's such a massive topic right now, but I say AI is kind of that input, and it helps us augment the intelligence, or intelligence augmentation is available there for us to make better decisions, improve our lives, learn much faster. So when you take that away, you'll have everything you want to know would be at a glance for you. So there's that means of collecting data and seeing that data and how we should display that data. So from this perspective, if we look at it, how it's impacting many different industries, we work in a media company, so it does have one purpose for it. We also work on a lot in immersive learning. We're doing work with researchers on how people are learning through augmented reality and virtual reality. And so what we are seeing is we're moving away from blindly following steps or rules to helping people get a deeper understanding to make these decisions in their life. And that comes very important in the courtroom.
Thanks, Casey. I mean, thank you for sticking to the time limit. And I think that's a very concise but a very clear exposition of what are some of the key features and what the utility actually looks like. I think with that, I want to come to Mark, but to me, again, as someone who admittedly has not used any AR or VR systems, I'm not even into that kind of gaming yet, but I do want to say that the very idea of me being able to position myself literally in the space where, let's not even go into crime, say if it's a case of negligence or medical negligence that you have to prove, and you place yourself in that hospital room where an operation was happening and you can recreate that instance, etc. I can absolutely imagine as a lawyer the benefits that would give to me, that would bring to me, either as someone who's filing that complaint or someone who's defending against it. I wanted your takes as someone who's worked a lot on legal ethical issues and a cross range of issues that emerged from the deployment of AR and VR systems, that if we were using, Shreya also extensively pointed out, in a country like India, you can really bolster the policing and bolster the man force and bolster prosecutorial efforts to actually convict people. What is your take? If we do introduce these kind of systems in the courtroom, what are some of the pros and cons and potential risks to something like this? How would this usage look like?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I do think Shreya covered so much, and it's really laying out a lot of this discussion here. When I think of virtual reality, the immersiveness, which is often translated as the field of view, that is important. Though what makes virtual reality feel real, we're talking about these things feeling real. What leads to that is interaction with a space. And that could be, complicated in the sense of there's someone else's avatar in front of you. Avatar is a term for when the virtual representation of a person that's actually controlled by a real person as opposed to a computer program. Having an avatar in the virtual world, that interacting with that person, talking with that person. I'm talking with, pixels on Zoom right now, but everyone feels very real because we're having a conversation. In virtual reality, interaction is important. And that even goes down to the level of moving your head and seeing the virtual scene move. Interaction is really what drives what makes virtual reality and augmented reality feel real. Augmented reality also also has the interactions between the virtual and the real objects. The more that happens, the more real the augmented reality add-ins seem. So with that in mind, the first thing I think of, especially in an adversarial system, is allowing both sides of the case to work with these virtual environments that people are creating. One of the insights that I like about the use of virtual reality as virtual reality in a courtroom, as opposed to a courtroom in virtual reality. Those are two different things that I'm sure we'll talk about in both. But the use of virtual reality in a courtroom is that you can represent an argument and sort of, this is what is established fact, this is what the argument is that I'm proposing. And being able to express that in virtual reality, yes, there's still design concerns to figure out of how do you show that. Are these hypothesized objects translucent, things like that. But virtual reality is all about narratives, and that's exactly what you're trying to convey as you tell the argument of what happened in a given situation, or as you try the facts. So the risks with that is just the strong emotional salience of being in a place in VR. People, one of the demos that has been, there's 30 years of probably the most classic virtual reality demo, which is a pit. You walk a plank over a giant hole and you look over and your palms start to sweat. That is a real threat to your body. Your body, well, it's not a real threat to your body. Your body processes it as a real threat because, hey, sure as heck looks like it. So especially when we talk about emotionally charged events, there are fine lines to draw, and there's many precedents in different jurisdictions for how that line is drawn. What is emotionally charged, what is not, etc. But that is a very sensitive line there.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That I feel like when you say that there's this, you rightly mentioned, I think even I have read up, like when I was just preparing for this webinar as well, I read about that example of like you just being positioned over like something that looks like a crevice, and if you do that in a VR simulation, it really does make you feel like that. And again, I'm not like in any way being plugged here or paid here by Apple, but I felt like I saw the commercial that they did a few weeks back when they launched their Apple Vision Pro. Just the sheer, I think Shreya also brought this up in her conversation, that there's a substantial difference between having your court proceedings over video conferencing, which became, I think, the normative for a lot of countries during the pandemic, versus you actually, what you just call, like you are hosting your court in the VR space. Like just going back to that commercial that I saw, it feels very real because you literally, like it's almost as if the judges are right here in my domain, and vice versa, that I'm right there in the courtroom standing next to them. It's not like I'm sitting across the screen. I can't be dressed in a coat on top and in my boxers underneath and attend my presentation and make my arguments. You really have to be prepared because it's a very lifelike simulation. So I think in that sense, that's very interesting. And I'm glad that you brought this distinction between this whole question of what you mentioned, that there is application of certain kinds of VR in the courtroom versus hosting the courtrooms in the VR space. And I feel that that's like an excellent sort of segue. We unfortunately do not have Justice Victoria with us today. It would have been really good to hear this from her in person, but she has prepared a video for us where, from what I understand, there's like an detailed account of like how they went about, what was the thought process and actually hosting this court proceeding in the metaverse, why they did that. I believe it was to bring better access to remote located litigants in the country of Colombia. But I think I'd rather say that if we can play that video now and have that on, we can probably hear her describe it in much better detail. Charlene, can we have that video?
Yes, Ahmed is going to play it now.
Thank you.
Judge Victoria, you have been invited to be part of the UNESCO webinar on virtual reality and augmented reality. There's an interest to know why did you decide to have a hearing in the metaverse? Thank you very much. Greetings to all from Colombia. I'm joining you from Santa Marta, the jewel of the Americas, and this is what I have to share with you. As a judge, I've always looked for ways to improve the efficiency of the proceedings. When I discovered the metaverse, I discovered that it had huge potential for trials. Therefore, I decided to use this approach on the basis of the following reasons. First of all, I was really impressed about how accessible the metaverse is. It might be difficult for some individuals to take themselves in person to their hearing due to health conditions, given their geographical location. And secondly, I was able to identify how efficient proceedings could be, because trials might take time and can be costly in terms of the time consumed, and the metaverse helps us to reduce distances in our daily activities in the court. Last year, when we bought the first virtual reality goggles, we started dreaming big, and we've always done tests before, because in my practice, we have working over 10 years with technology projects. I have a website and my YouTube channel, Victoria Online. And as we usually do when we have virtual cafe meetings, we would describe the uses of the metaverse. And we thought that could be an alternative for remote hearings. And we were very lucky because one of our followers on our YouTube channel and actually had made a complaint in our court, requested to have the hearing in the metaverse, and based on all the beauties that we talk about technology, so we notified each one of the parties the good news that the National Police, which was the respondent in this case, and the prosecutor's office agreed as well to have the hearing in the metaverse, as well as my colleagues in court. So on April the 1st, we had the first hearing. It was very important. When we had the first motion hearing, we used ChatGPT to learn about how to create the avatars and security measures. Now that we are describing the metaverse, would you say that virtual reality and augmented reality is the future, or is this just a one-off hearing? If so, what would you say would be the reforms that need to be done legally and in terms of policy to guarantee a fair process? Well, virtual reality and augmented reality represent a new technological frontier, and a massive adoption of those tools can have the possibility to benefit society and, of course, the administration of justice. In the judiciary, the use of these technologies could be anomalous or could be seen as a one-off hearing, but using technology is becoming the general norm. The future of using these tools in the judiciary depend on how we face several challenges. The first challenge to face is the digital divide, because not everybody has the same access to technology, and that could limit the use of those tools. But there are other important benefits that are linked to privacy and the security of data that, of course, have to be consensuously addressed. The adoption of these tools need to be ethical, and in order to be successful in the judiciary, we need legal changes and policy changes. First of all, investments are needed in digital infrastructure, digital tools, and education to make sure that everybody using this technology know how to use them well and how to use them responsibly. Secondly, we need policy, we need norms to protect the privacy of all the data. This is important. We need, in that sense, to envision training and continuous professional development for justice operators, judges, lawyers. All of us, we need to understand how technology works and how it can be used ethically and efficiently. Madam Judge, to which extent augmented reality and virtual reality could be used to recreate crime scenes or the use of exhibits? Would it be possible to present realistic exhibits to judges in Colombia and the world? First of all, yes, we can have a more realistic representations of the crime scene instead of only using testimonials and still images. Judges and juries could walk around a crime scene virtually and could have a look from different angles, and that would lead to a better understanding of the crime scene, and of course that would lead to more precise judicial decisions. Another element to consider is the following. Virtual reality could be a valuable tool to present exhibits in court. We could use virtual reality to recreate a traffic incident, for example, or any other incident, and we, by using tools, could have a 3D view of what happened. Lawyers and judges could understand what happened better. Madam Judge, what are your advice? What is your advice in terms of a conscientious use of virtual reality and augmented reality in Colombia and abroad without compromising integrity in the proceedings? I would like to share with my dear colleagues the following tips to venture using technology. First of all, I would recommend training. All judges and the court staff, as you have seen from my colleagues, they receive training, and we have to validate that every piece of evidence is valid. In augmented reality or virtual reality, we need to use reliable tools, and for that, technical experts will be needed and new rules of procedure. Now, we need to make sure that there is no bias inserted in the process. For example, the emotional impact could have an effect on judges, and that would affect fairness. Number 4, access. It is very important to make sure that all parties, the respondent, lawyers, prosecutors, must have an equitable access to technology. 5th recommendation, privacy and consent. Privacy and consent must be carefully analyzed, specifically when it comes to recreating crime scenes related to offenses that have victims and witnesses. Then, legislation and regulation. Lawmakers and regulation makers must work to update the norms and legislation to be open to the use of technology. And lastly, collaboration and best practices. And to finish, if I may, I would take 2 minutes of your time to show how we conducted our hearing. Well, for our setting, we used free tools. We used Meta and we used Horizon. Let's click play. In this Metaverse example, we can see that there is a constant exchange of messages. Having a hearing in the Metaverse is not a violation to the due process and rules of procedure. That might be seen as such, but as you can see, this is my avatar. This was the biggest reluctance after the trial, especially my avatar. So we hope that technology moves along so in the future we can have our own digital identity that resembles us in reality. And probably that was the aspect that created the largest number of reluctancy. Now, in terms of the interaction of the parties, here you have the respondent, here you have the prosecutor and the judge, but there is a TV inside the metaverse. What does that mean? The metaverse is inclusive. If someone is not willing to use the goggles because of a health concern or any other reason, one might think that we're not creating a gap because they can join the video call. They are going to receive a call from our court so they can answer like this. So she can be present with every participant already joining the metaverse, and everybody can interact. It's worthwhile mentioning that. Now, let's talk about the parties. We ran tests to make sure that everybody present represent a digital image of an individual. I would like to ask the prosecutor to raise his right hand, please. Now, thank you, counsel. I'm going to ask the respondent, National Police. Can you raise your left hand, please? Thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask to raise the two hands up. I'm going to ask the complainant to raise the two hands, and well, as you were able to see, we're able to respond your questions, and you can find more invitation to Victoria online. And these are very useful tools to the administration of justice. So thank you very much. I wish you the best and have a great meeting.
Once again, thank you, Justice Victoria. If you end up seeing this recording, I wanted to express our gratitude for that very detailed video. And thank you to the translators for such a flawless translation of the whole thing. I think very interesting to me, again, like I feel like this brings up some interesting questions, particularly like we've been talking about the potential of how these systems can be used and what all they can accomplish for the justice system or for the policing. But I think there are some serious concerns around in terms of whether countries have adequate infrastructure. We're talking about a public institution. This is not a company that is trying to create that ecosystem within its own small corporate walls. This is about access to justice, which I would believe is like a legal right in most jurisdictions that we all sort of come from. So with that, I think I want to head over to Susan. Susan, thanks for joining us on such short notice. But my question is that you obviously are working in the space of like AI and digital rights, but I also believe in terms of digital rights in general. And I see, like, again, I can think of certain concerns if I was to talk about India, but keeping the realities, the unique realities of a continent and a space like Africa, where again, you might have infrastructural limitations, or there might be an already existing sort of disparate access to justice in your normal judicial processes. How do you see AR and VR systems adding or reducing that kind of disparity or affecting it in any way? I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you for that question. I mean, and I just wanted to start by kind of echoing something that Shreya pointed out on our interpretation of digital rights and how, you know, it's important to have safeguards, because that really is the backbone of being able to effectively use some of these innovative tools. Is how are we balancing the conversation between functionality and also, you know, privacy, safety, protection. There's also been cases of like rape on some of these, you know, virtual reality or gaming systems. So it's a really important conversation to be having. And maybe to touch on the African perspective. So of course, these innovative tools could, you know, revolutionize how we approach and conduct legal proceedings in Africa, and embracing them will ensure like our legal systems evolve to meet the modern era. But we haven't really seen any reported cases of its use in Africa. We have different sectors that are using it in the field of medicine, in gaming, as I mentioned, but in courtrooms, it's not really explored. Something interesting that came up when Cassie was giving her definition was there's this incident of this German investigator who created an immersive environment to recreate the historical events of the Nazi era. So it's really great to be able to contextualize some of these experiences. And something else that came up when she was speaking was this idea of emotional distress. It's hard to quantify how you felt and that impact in a courtroom. So with virtual reality or augmented reality or extended reality, which is the family of this innovative technology, we're able to transcend these conventional parameters that we've had historically. So it really creates a new realm of justice delivery, how we can be able to expand on how we're able to kind of facilitate these complaints or issues that the citizenry are experiencing, and also build trust and efficiency with the judicial system itself. That being said, in terms of judicial actors, there is quite a knowledge gap and a skills gap, and that is also seen in the citizenry. So some of the challenges with adoption of virtual and augmented reality are, as you've said, internet penetration, electricity penetration, ICT skills gap, infrastructural challenges, lack of high-speed internet. I kind of dipped on the call, I don't know if you noticed. So, these are the realities of being in Africa. Mobile infrastructure, and literacy rates. Another thing that's really on the rise is inequality. So urban areas, for example, 2/3 of children who go to school, primary school, 2/3 of children who start primary school reach final grade. So there's a deficit in terms of the population and their ability to kind of upskill or gain knowledge that will help them navigate these systems. And when you look at, for example, internet penetration in Kenya, it's at 33%. In India, I believe it's like 50%. So we're really not where we need to be in terms of our capacity to realize some of these innovative tools. And when you look at, for example, virtual courts in the global south, this is something that was catalyzed by the pandemic. And I think of course, the pandemic was not that nice, but it brought about different things that helped us reimagine how we could deliver justice. And also to help empower people to be able, for example, to attend court proceedings. So you have video conferencing that really blew up during that period. And now we're considering this, as Shreya mentioned, the difference between video conferencing and a virtual reality courtroom. How can we improve on these experiences and build infrastructure and systems and facilitate pathways for justice delivery? So that really is the conversation in Africa, and we are trailing behind, but the potential is really wide. You have certain aspects as overcoming distance and accessibility challenges through, like remote access of court proceedings. You have witnessing, examination, and evidence. You have presentation, clarity and demonstrative evidence. Just to go back to virtual courts, in Africa, there are about 22 countries that currently have virtual courts, and 29 that have e-filing systems. But again, like there's still other countries that haven't adopted or haven't kind of digitized their legal services. Sometime in December, the Lawyers Hub did a report on an analysis of virtual courts in Africa, and we did touch on some of the countries that are moving ahead in terms of this. So we have like Nigeria, Kenya, Gambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Rwanda, and Egypt, which is one of the first adopters of an electronic case management system. So we're seeing there is some movement, but we're still kind of trailing behind. And some of the, maybe I can touch on the potential risks and how we can finally enhance knowledge and skills of judicial actors. So for risks, we have language interpretation and cultural diversity. In Africa and India, there's quite a rich cultural diversity. And how do you translate that in terms of context when it comes to these virtual reality and augmented reality systems? There's over 2,000 languages in Africa, for example, and this forms 30% of the world's languages. So how are we contextualizing these things in the delivery of justice? We have privacy and data protection. Shreya mentioned about some of the rape cases. This still holds true in Africa. How do we ensure that there's a safe space for some of the sensitive information that is being conveyed? And also the cost and access to justice. Amin, you seem to have a preference for Apple, but Meta is about to launch their Meta Quest 3, and it's costed at $499. That is not a sustainable cost at all. For example, if it were to be integrated into our justice system in Kenya. So these are some of the potential risks in terms of implementation. And finally, maybe when we talk about enhancing skills of judicial actors, the three main things is digital literacy, capacity building, and mentorship. Digital literacy when it comes to helping them understand how to access these systems, how to integrate the information in a meaningful way. And Cassie mentioned this about providing a deeper understanding to make decisions. And that really is what it is. We need to allow them to not just sit at the table, but be part of the conversation because they contribute to this delivery of justice. And then of course, capacity building, the technical capabilities. And I think mentorship is a great space when you look at it from creating a supportive ecosystem. So we have those that are nurturing the growth and ensuring that the knowledge is efficiently being transferred from the experts or those who understand it to those who are new to the technology or to the tool. So yes, I think I'll leave it. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Susan. No, I think you've actually touched a series of issues that definitely come to my mind as well. And I'm glad, thank you for like flagging this thing out, which you did, like even with respect to when you look at Africa, I think this is for me like a pet peeve that when we talk about tech accessibility and ensuring diversity in these conversations, we generally tend to build monoliths, whether it's Africa or the global South, but even within those regions, there is a substantial distinction in the way tech access works and the way disparity works. Again, I will just like add it as a disclaimer. I have nothing to do with Apple. I have no preference. I've not used any AR, VR headset in my life, but I think I do want to circle back to particularly this issue that has continuously emerged, whether it was in Justice Victoria's presentation, and now you've called it out very categorically. You've given an actual cost. Like we're talking about a headset that probably costs around $500 a piece. In most parts of the world, that would be an unaffordable form of infrastructure that you want to integrate into an ecosystem that is largely providing a public service, and not just like a public service that is voluntary. Access to justice is, in most cases, like I mentioned, a fundamental right that citizens and even non-citizens that are residing in that country work. It is integral to your rule of law as being a pillar of any kind of country, as a kind of democracy that you're working in. So Casey, with that, I want to come back to you again, since you particularly, again, you work with specialists in Meta, you have an industry perspective. Is it something that can have an industry participation? Or is it something where perhaps the judiciary or the government needs to consider building its own systems, maybe in some kind of coordination or some kind of skill sharing and knowledge sharing with a private partner, maybe like in a public-private partnership kind of format? But how do we actually ensure that the cost of this is not as high, because the technology is clearly expensive in production and in delivery? It's not feasible in a pure economical sense for a judiciary in most parts of the world. So how do we make it more feasible?
I love this question so much. And I'm not going to speak on behalf of Meta, but I'm going to speak on behalf of my own personal experiences. I've lived in Asia for the past 12 years. While I am in Singapore, I do visit many of the Southeast Asian countries. I do support and mentor developers and people that are building businesses in this space in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, even Myanmar. So that knowledge transfer that you were talking about, that is something that I'm doing 100%. I'm like, let's build the economic development by teaching these skill sets that can be taught and learned for free online, but they do need some people to help and guide them. So if we think of in terms of how do we bring access to the physical hardware, currently everybody that has a phone, has an Instagram account, has a TikTok account, has a Snapchat account, can download apps on either the App Store or the Google Play Store. They already have access to augmented reality. Okay, so they have it. People are using it. We have on our platforms, we do have many people in the growing markets and developing markets that people are already using this, and students, young people are picking up the tools in order to build and learn how to do that themselves naturally. To come back to your point on what is it going to take in order to lower this barrier, one, it's going to take collaborations between developers, policymakers, experts like from academia and the telecoms, and multiple people working together in a forum like this in order to see how we can make the world a better place for everybody in a more equitable fashion. And what I really love is that there is competition, and but there is this kind of like race to the AR glasses. And that's always a great thing for the consumer. And hopefully we can find ways to bring those costs down in production. To make a piece of AR glasses or even the virtual reality, there's multiple companies that are servicing and building those components, and it's all part of that process. So when those collectively, all of those prices fall down, then we will see the hardware prices do come down as well.
Okay. I mean, I think personally speaking, I am a bit hesitant about this. Like I completely appreciate the idea of collaboration here. I feel that it's easier said than done. Like I speak completely from my experience. Like I work significantly with the Indian Supreme Court and the E-Committee in the Supreme Court, which has basically steered our last 2 decades of tech integration in the courts. So I'm not going to say that there's no collaboration. It's been a work in progress, and the pandemic definitely sort of augmented that whole push. But
Nice.
yeah, I think, I hope, I don't want to be the person that says, I wish there's another pandemic that steers it, but I think we need some kind of like these cataclysmic events that really push the decision makers in our time to take more proactive steps. And I hope it can be something less destructive than a global pandemic. with that, I think I want to come back to Mark again. Mark, so I think we've had a lot of discussion around potential users. We've had discussions around general challenges of accessibility that definitely might arise. I wanted to come back to you with respect to more ethical and legal risks that AR and VR systems pose. Particularly, I think, again, Justice Victoria's presentation mentioned something like, say, we are not very sure how this kind of an evidence would be admissible in a court of law. Like, I, again, speak from, like, if I was to bring the Indian perspective, India's Evidence Act, in terms of electronic evidence, is still in the days of floppy disks and email documents. So any kind of evidence that is created through an AR VR system would simply not even be fitting within the legislative framework when you talk about admissibility of evidence. And legal risks would also be probably like we've flagged that when you are talking about these kind of ecosystems, these kind of immersive technologies, there is obviously a substantive amount of personal and potentially even sensitive personal information that gets collected, processed, stored, whether it is within the judiciary or within a private entity with the judiciary's oversight. How does that work? So there are these questions that emerge. And lastly, this was something that I kept having, like, because we seem to be talking a lot about crime scene recreation. There's this thing that while prosecution needs to be aided, there is also this equal right in most jurisdictions of having a prosecutorial burden of proving an offense beyond reasonable doubt. And I feel that in some cases, criminal defendants definitely come with more means and resources than what the prosecution or the state may offer. And if you allow this kind of an AR VR system to influence judges and judiciaries or jury pools to be exposed to a more realistic simulation, does it give an unfair sort of edge to richer litigants, basically? Again, like, not really an accessibility issue, but probably somewhat yes. And like it sort of contaminates your idea of due process and the rule of law in one sense. So yeah, like a bundle of these questions, if we are doing them from a legal and ethical standpoint, how do we address them? Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So with the reminding everyone that my background is media and computer science and not law per se, I've sort of been thrown into this as I've been applying machine learning to the motion data. Actually, I should explain that because that's one of the questions that you're asking. Part of my work is understanding the privacy risks of augmented and virtual reality. So as with most consumer virtual reality devices, there's a headset, that toaster that Casey mentioned, hand controllers in order to move your hands around the world, in order to render your elbows as you move them around. And in order for VR to work, those positions need to be tracked. You need to be measured. They need to be measured. The headset needs to know when you move your head left to render the scene from a slightly different angle, going back to interaction being such a fundamental part of experiencing virtual reality. That data needs to be transferred to everyone else. And if you're going to see me move my hands around a lot like I do, you need your virtual reality headset needs to know the data of where my head is and where my hands are. That data by itself can tell you a lot of things. We had a study where we collected people watching 360-degree video. We had 500 different participants come in, some to the lab, some to a museum, watch a video for about 5 minutes, and rate how the videos made them feel. That was the original purpose of the experiment. With the discussions about privacy and the fact that we had collected this data and it was permissible to use it for other purposes, we took that motion data, that head and hands position and rotation, and processed it, and then trained a machine learning algorithm to recognize the different 511 participants, and then gave it an unlabeled piece of data and put it through the system, asked, hey, whose data who's moving like this? Whose data is this? And to my surprise, given 511 potential options, the algorithm was correct 95% of the time, which is quite accurate, so much more accurate than I expected. And it spawned a whole, wow, here's some evidence of privacy issues in VR. And so that sort of tossed me into the legal and ethical questions that surround virtual reality. And just any sort of mediating technology, whether we're on Zoom or otherwise, there are so many steps that this data goes through. And whether you're talking about having access to the internet, making sure that content is available when you need it to, making sure that that access is stable. I mean, even yesterday I was on Zoom calls and the internet was dropping out. And then also making sure that only the people that need to see that data can see that data. There's two sides there when it comes to security. So those are both important principles to think about in a courtroom. In some jurisdictions, there's rules about what you can record, and there's all sorts of physical security that is put in place to make sure that that happens. People can get to the places they need to, and people that don't need to get to the access to those places cannot have access to those places. And that needs to be implemented in these social VR platforms, in these metaverse platforms. As far as admissibility, sort of taking virtual reality, putting it into the courtroom as opposed to vice versa. Like I mentioned, my background is not law, but I have been reading up, especially for this panel. And there are several comparisons that I'd like to make as a media technologist that could be useful in determining what is admissible in these kinds of situations. Virtual reality oftentimes, me and the researchers I work with, we place it in between real life and sort of, especially in this kind of a context, teleconferencing. So you need to ask, if this were a video, would this be admissible? Would this be acceptable? If this were in person, would this be admissible? Would this be acceptable? And then specifically when it comes to in person, asking someone to be in that spot in a fabricated environment. I learned, juries in the US in some cases can visit the locations of incidents or crimes. And that's something you can do in virtual reality. The rules around that, for example, there's a jurisdiction where there's no comments that one can possibly make as you walk through the scene. Well, that would very much hinder what you can do in a virtual reality environment. If we're going to continue that principle forward, that would certainly be a very strong principle to use against the use of immersive environments, and I think would provide strong control for what is admissible and what is not. So yeah, asking, would it be acceptable at video? Would it be acceptable in person? And then would you have whoever's in the virtual reality headset and seeing this environment, would you have them actually physically in the space? And is that admissible as well? In my mind, there were 3 questions. I answered 2 of them.
I think that's good enough, because we're also coming close on the time. But I particularly, I think your point on admissibility of evidence is strong, because I feel it's at least in my experience, is the general rule that a lot of tech regulation tries to adopt, which is that basically try to mimic what was happening in the more analog sense with respect to those things. And if it was admissible, if it was working, or how it was regulated, you try to import that regulation into a digital environment and see if that works. So some sort of similarity in that. So we are coming close. Susan, I had one more question for you, but I think there's also a question in the Q&A which sort of aligns with what I wanted to ask. So maybe you can take both of those up together, and then we have like maybe one other question for Shreya from the Q&A. Meanwhile, also, if there are any questions directly in the Q&A that you can respond to, please do respond to in writing. So Susan, what I wanted to check with you was, you like, just again, like going back, like there's a lot of back and forth, but going back to what you mentioned, that one of the key components here is mentoring, developing capacity of judicial actors, litigants, and people who are likely to interact with this technology. I think this also sort of is somewhat similar to one of the questions from the advocate in Kenya, that what would you say is the most in-demand skill set today for lawyers hoping to explore the digital space, particularly in terms of AR, VR? Like, I know there's a slight sort of disparity that's probably like more in terms of like how as a lawyer I can work in that space, but I think like general capacity building, and like when you say that we need to build capacity building for interaction with these technologies, whether it is for judges, whether it is for lawyers, potential litigants, if you could distill that into like maybe 2 or 3 key points, what would your strategy be to that end?
Thank you. I mean, and yes, it applies to lawyers as well, because they are stakeholders in the judicial system and the delivery of justice. So I think one of the important like aspects to consider is also the legislative framework. Yes, we have these technologies, we have emerging technologies, and most of them are being deployed, but there has to be a regulatory or legislative framework that establishes and protects human rights, for example, and digital rights. So legislative frameworks are an important aspect to consider, especially for a lawyer, for example. So in Kenya, we don't have a policy on virtual reality or augmented reality or just extended reality in general. We don't have a law that governs or guides the same. So this is a key area for lawyers to start to steer the conversation and start to imagine what this framework would look like. And then this, of course, would be championed by the representative on the ministry or the governing body. So which would be maybe the ICT department or ministry. So it's almost like looking at your role from what you usually do. You go to court, so there's cases. You interpret the law, so of course there's law. So those are maybe from the top of my head, the key kind of areas that I would say are good to look at. And also in terms of policy, I think policy is really an underdog when it comes to these conversations, because not many people feel that they are part of the conversation, but policymaking is an integral part of how these technologies are adopted, how a culture is built around the deployment and the efficiency of these systems, and also the ethical applications of these systems. So lawyers also have an important role in not just facilitating some of these things, but in ensuring that this kind of knowledge gap or skill gap is bridged or mitigated. And you do have lawyers who are, like in Kenya, we have a virtual reality, augmented reality community, and you have lawyers who have like esports teams, and have, some experience and expertise with regard to the industry. So these are also opportunities to engage judicial actors and have the conversation and probably pursue mentorship. Because this is how we're able to collaborate. This is a practical way for us to be able to build capacity. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, I think it also circles back to the larger collaboration that Casey was mentioning earlier. Not just in terms of like the development of the technology, but particularly I agree. Like I think I strongly second your point that policy is always an underdog playing catch up to these kind of situations. Perhaps it's important to collaborate there and build it at a faster pace as well, more preemptively rather than reactively. I also just want to plug in, since we were talking about particularly around admissibility of evidence. The last webinar was related to that. It was on the admissibility challenge with respect to AI generated evidence. The recordings are up on UNESCO's channels on YouTube and other platforms. So you might want to go check those out. And there's an interesting question. It's not really directed to any particular speaker, so feel free to jump in and take it. But the question is that with these kind of technologies, we had the whole video conferencing thing during the pandemic when most physical courtrooms were sort of in a lockdown or were not really operational, or bare minimum facilities were being operated physically, and mostly it was being held virtually. Do we think that we could do away completely with physical premises, or at the very least move to smaller buildings, thus saving some substantial cost in the upkeep in potential areas, renting these places, and maybe utilizing or redirecting that money towards better investment of digital infrastructure? This is slightly futuristic. I think this is more like a 10-year, 20-year vision for a judiciary, but if there are any takers for this question, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Hi.
I think, yeah,
Sorry.
okay.
Okay.
No, you go.
Shreya, you unmuted first, so you go first.
Oh, thank you. So actually, I've been thinking about this question. So the way I look at it is, I think Justice Victoria mentioned something related to hybrid court systems. So in the case of, I don't know if I heard her correctly, and please feel free to correct me. But and I think Cassie will be able to provide more context for this. But the first time I used Horizon World, I entered through my app. I didn't have access to headsets. So there is a argument to be made that in case of video conferencing, for example, the rules of video conferencing provide the option for either party to apply for a conference through video conferencing, and the court will decide based on fairness and availability and so on whether this application will be accepted. And the court may suo moto also decide to have a video conferencing meeting. So the way I look at this, issue, like you mentioned, reducing funding and, having smaller courtrooms, I don't know if that would necessarily serve. Instead of that, I think we could have virtual courtrooms that have a hybrid component. So let's say there is one party which has access to a headset and enter the virtual courtroom. I'm imagining a scenario in which, let's say, a rape victim applies to the court for having a virtual reality courtroom hearing. So she appears through an avatar, and the other side, which let's say the accused does not have access to expensive headsets and so on, enters directly through the app. So that's an option. That's an option that I think the technology provides the hybrid option. So I think that's my answer. That instead of reducing physical courtrooms, we can have hybrid courtrooms that serve the needs of specific people.
And definitely, if you're hybridizing the courtroom, there is that capacity, you're not dispensing with physical presence, but there is definitely an argument, at least in theory, to be made for cost reduction, or rather cost redirection towards developing more digital infrastructure. Susan, we have 2 more minutes. Quick thoughts.
Shreya said what I was going to say, and yeah, I was just also maybe the other point to make is fundamentally there's this aspect of seeing your accuser. So it'll be interesting to see moving forward if we're able to interpret that, for example, by using holograms, or it'll be interesting to see, again, as you said, in 10 to 20 years. But for now, I think it's more going to be a hybridized system.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. I think we are well in time. I take that as a personal win for this panel. Excellent. I do want to say that I think we've covered a significant amount of things, starting from very basic breakdown of what the technologies are that we were talking about, to how they present a diversity of potential use cases in policing, in the larger criminal justice system, or the justice system in general, to some of the key risks, whether it is with respect to more legal risks of privacy, bias, or a more disparate access to justice, to more ethical or economical challenges of how do we make this affordable. And I think for me, it becomes abundantly clear that technological interventions like AR and VR solutions are not going to remain limited to ancillary or non-judicial processes. We are conceptualizing, talking about them, and in some cases, even implementing them as an integral part of your justice dispensation process or your judicial decision-making process. So we need to utilize these systems in a safe manner, as was repeatedly mentioned by Susan and others. We need to have adequate capacity building exercises for judges and lawyers. And that is precisely where I feel that webinars like this and efforts that are being made by UNESCO are excellent. I'm glad that I could be a part of this panel through a moderation, and thank you. Good evening to you all. Over to you, Charlene.
Thank you very much, Amin. So I want to again also thank all of the speakers for sharing your expertise, knowledge, and experiences. It was a very interesting discussion. Also, of course, special thank you to you, Amin, who guided this discussion. And also thank you to Pratik Sibal for giving me the opportunity to develop this series of webinars and bring light to these emerging and very important issues. I would like to also mention that the recordings of all our webinars are available on the UNESCO YouTube channel. And this recording will probably also be uploaded next week. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and hope to see you in the future on this important work. Thank you.